In the first light of the morning on August 9, 1969, the quiet above Los Angeles was broken by a discovery that would leave even experienced homicide detectives struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. However, was a crime scene so shocking that many of the officers who entered would later admit they had never encountered anything like it. It was not only the brutality that unsettled them. It was the silence that followed it. Personal belongings remained where they had been left only hours earlier. Half-finished plans for the weekend had been interrupted without warning. At first, investigators believed they were looking at an isolated act of unimaginable cruelty. There appeared to be no obvious motive, no robbery, and no immediate explanation for why this particular house had become the setting for one of the most infamous crimes in American history. The address was 10050 Cielo Drive, a beautiful home overlooking the city, known among Hollywood's rising stars as a peaceful retreat from the constant attention of cameras and reporters. Among those found inside was a young actress just 26 years old and 8 months pregnant, eagerly preparing to welcome her first child. Her name was Sharon Tate. As years passed, investigators, surviving witnesses, and newly released testimony revealed details that had rarely been understood by the public. Long before her name became inseparable from one of the most infamous crimes in American history, Sharon Tate was known for something entirely different. People who met her rarely spoke first about her beauty, even though magazines often described her as one of Hollywood's most striking young actresses. Sharon Marie Tate was born on January 24, 1943, in Dallas, Texas, the eldest daughter of Colonel Paul Tate, an officer in the United States Army, and his wife, Doris. As a teenager living with her family overseas during one of her father's military assignments in Italy, Sharon began entering local beauty competitions. She won several of them almost effortlessly. Modeling opportunities soon followed, introducing her to photographers, filmmakers, and producers who immediately recognized her screen presence. Her first experiences in film were small, often little more than background appearances, but they gave her a glimpse into a world she had never imagined joining. By the mid-1960s, Hollywood had begun to notice. Roles in films such as Eye of the Devil, The Fearless Vampire Killers, and Valley of the Dolls transformed her from an aspiring actress into one of the industry's brightest rising stars. It was during the filming of The Fearless Vampire Killers that Sharon met the young Polish director Roman Polanski. At first, he questioned whether she was right for the role. As filming progressed, however, admiration gradually turned into affection. Their relationship developed away from Hollywood's usual spectacle, growing through months spent working together rather than through carefully staged publicity. When they married in January 1968, they quickly became one of the most talked-about couples in the entertainment world. Newspapers celebrated them as symbols of a new Hollywood generation. By the summer of 1969, she was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Friends later recalled that she was excited, hopeful, and already making plans for the future after becoming a mother. To anyone looking from the outside, Sharon Tate appeared to have everything that Hollywood promised. By the summer of 1969, the house at 10050 Cielo Drive seemed like the perfect place to escape the relentless pace of Hollywood. She and Roman Polanski had rented the property earlier that year while he continued building his career as a filmmaker. There was one important difference that summer. Roman Polanski was not there. Work had taken him to Europe, where he was developing his next film project. Sharon remained in Los Angeles to be close to her doctors during the final weeks of her pregnancy. To make sure she was not alone, several close friends spent time with her at the house. Before Sharon and Roman moved in, the property had been rented by Terry Melcher, a successful music producer known throughout the entertainment industry. During that time, an aspiring musician named Charles Manson had unsuccessfully tried to persuade Melcher to help launch his recording career. The meetings had gone nowhere, and eventually Melcher left the property months before Sharon arrived. That detail would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire investigation. What remains unclear is exactly how much Manson understood about who now lived at Cielo Drive. On the evening of August 8, 1969, they finally did. What began as an ordinary summer night would become one of the most carefully reconstructed timelines in American criminal history. On Friday, August 8, 1969, there was nothing about the day that suggested it would be remembered for generations. Los Angeles was warm, the skies were clear, and for Sharon Tate, the day unfolded much as countless summer days had before it. She was only weeks away from giving birth, and those around her later recalled that her thoughts were increasingly focused on becoming a mother rather than on Hollywood. With Roman Polanski still working in Europe, Sharon spent the day in the company of close friends who had been keeping her company while she waited for his return. That evening, Sharon went out for dinner with Jay Sebring, a renowned Hollywood hairstylist, and one of her closest friends, Abigail Folger, the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and Abigail's boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer and longtime friend of Roman Polanski. The group chose El Coyote Café, a popular Mexican restaurant that had served countless actors, musicians, and filmmakers over the years. The dinner itself appeared completely uneventful. Witnesses remembered nothing unusual about the group. They laughed, ordered food, and left without attracting any special attention. After leaving the restaurant, the group returned to Cielo Drive. The drive back through the hills was quiet, and by all accounts, the atmosphere inside the house remained relaxed. One of the final people expected at the property was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had stopped by the estate's guest house to visit its caretaker, William Garretson. Parent had no connection to Sharon Tate or the others inside the main house. His visit lasted only a short time before he decided to leave. The difference between arriving early, staying late, or choosing one road over another would become part of a timeline detectives reconstructed again and again. As darkness settled over the hills, the lights inside the house gradually went out one by one. The neighborhood itself remained quiet. Yet several miles away, another group had already begun moving through Los Angeles with a very different purpose. That ordinary routine is what makes the story so haunting. The people inside Cielo Drive were making plans for tomorrow, for the coming week, and in Sharon's case, for the child she expected to meet within days. That illusion of peace ended shortly after people connected to the property began arriving and realized something was terribly wrong. Police officers responding to the scene entered a house unlike any they had encountered before. It was not simply that several people had lost their lives. It was the way the scene confronted them all at once. Experienced investigators are trained to separate emotion from evidence. Nothing about it appeared ordinary. There were multiple victims, but no clear explanation for why they had been targeted. There was no obvious sign that the house had been robbed. Expensive possessions remained where they belonged. Every room seemed to raise another question. Forensic teams spent hours carefully documenting the house, photographing evidence, collecting fingerprints, and preserving every possible clue. Outside the house, the news spread with astonishing speed. Hollywood, accustomed to scandals and celebrity gossip, suddenly found itself confronting something entirely different. Reporters gathered near the property, helicopters circled overhead, and newspapers rushed to confirm the identities of those involved. As the names became public, disbelief quickly turned into national shock. Among the victims was Sharon Tate, only weeks away from giving birth to her first child. For many Americans, that single fact overshadowed everything else. Newspapers around the world carried her photograph, and the tragedy immediately became far more than another criminal investigation. The evidence showed that several people had been inside the property during the attack, but it offered no immediate answer as to who they were or why they had chosen that particular house. Each theory seemed to solve one problem while creating several new ones. As the investigation continued, another unsettling realization emerged. Certain details found at the scene did not resemble the patterns detectives normally associated with a conventional homicide investigation. For weeks, the case remained one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries. The answers would not come from the house itself but from a separate investigation unfolding elsewhere in California. In the days following the murders, detectives worked almost without pause. Every lead was pursued, every witness interviewed, and every piece of physical evidence examined. Yet despite the enormous resources devoted to the investigation, the case refused to come together. Because several of the victims were connected to Hollywood, speculation quickly filled newspapers and television broadcasts. What made the case even more frustrating was the apparent lack of a logical motive. Then, only one day later, another shocking crime occurred. On the night of August 10, 1969, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered inside their Los Angeles home under circumstances that immediately caught investigators' attention. At first, detectives working the two cases believed they might be unrelated. The victims came from different backgrounds, lived in different neighborhoods, and had no known connection to one another. But similarities began to emerge. As evidence was carefully compared, investigators noticed details that suggested both attacks might have been carried out by the same group. What had seemed like two separate investigations slowly began to merge into one much larger and far more disturbing picture. The breakthrough, however, did not come from Hollywood. It came months later from an entirely different direction. In October 1969, members of a remote group living at Spahn Ranch, on the outskirts of Los Angeles, were arrested during an investigation unrelated to the Tate murders. At first, the arrests appeared insignificant. But as investigators interviewed those connected to the ranch, fragments of information began falling into place. The name that repeatedly surfaced was Charles Manson. To many Americans at the time, Manson was virtually unknown. He was not a famous criminal, a powerful gang leader, or a public figure. Instead, he had gathered around himself a devoted group of mostly young followers who believed his increasingly extreme worldview without question. As detectives dug deeper, former members of the group began providing information that transformed the investigation. Testimony described how Manson had convinced his followers that society was on the verge of catastrophic conflict. According to witnesses, he believed violent acts could help trigger that conflict and reshape the world according to his own distorted vision. The victims at Cielo Drive had not been selected because of personal grudges or financial disputes in the way investigators had originally imagined. Instead, they appeared to have become part of a much larger and deeply irrational plan driven by ideology, manipulation, and absolute devotion to one man's influence. When arrests were finally made, the nation struggled to understand how a small group of ordinary young people could have carried out crimes of such extraordinary brutality under the direction of someone they viewed almost as a prophet. As the trials unfolded and years passed, witnesses continued to reveal new information about the final hours leading up to the murders. Although the convictions brought the criminal case to an end, they did not end the questions. In many ways, they marked the beginning of a different investigation, one carried out over decades by detectives, prosecutors, journalists, historians, and even some of the people who had once stood inside the Manson family itself. One of the first things investigators came to understand was how much of the original public narrative had been shaped by confusion. In the hours immediately after the murders, facts were scarce and rumors were everywhere. Another realization came from the sheer ordinariness of the evening before everything changed. Friends who had spent time with Sharon in the days leading up to the murders consistently described someone who was excited about becoming a mother. She was making plans for the future, discussing the baby's arrival, and counting the days until Roman Polanski returned from Europe. Nothing in her behavior suggested fear or concern. Investigators later said that this normality made the tragedy even more difficult to process. There had been no obvious warning that danger was approaching. As the years passed, surviving investigators also reflected on how remarkably random the victim's presence at the house had been. Some had visited only because they happened to be with friends that evening. Former members of the Manson family also provided testimony and interviews that shed light on the mindset inside the group. While many details had already been presented during the trial, later accounts helped investigators better understand the atmosphere of manipulation that surrounded Charles Manson. Even decades later, some aspects of the case continue to be debated by researchers. Perhaps the most lasting impression left on investigators was not a single piece of evidence but the human cost behind the headlines. For Sharon Tate, that future had seemed especially close. She was only weeks away from becoming a mother, surrounded by people who believed they were celebrating the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Instead, history would remember her almost entirely for the way her story ended rather than the life she had been building before that night. More than half a century later, the murders at Cielo Drive continue to be studied not only because of their brutality, but because they marked a turning point in American culture.